policy exchange discussion, a joined-up strategy for global Britain, making sure Brexit, trade and industrial policy work together, which is sponsored by De La Rue, which is a company I've known for many years. It's a company that's always fascinated me, because it really is an exemplar of the great mercantile, commercial, international world history of the United Kingdom. Its special trick is printing banknotes for about 140 countries around the world. Obviously, it's moved on to other secure technologies as well. But it is a very, very interesting international company, and it's a very particular company to the commercial heritage of the United Kingdom, going right back to the, I think, 1740s, and it's very much at the cutting edge of what our commercial future is going to be if we actually pull off the opportunities, in my view, that we will have as part of Brexit. Now, obviously, it's going to involve a lot of trade challenges, a lot of challenges about doing some of the things that we should have done anyway in or out of Europe, perfecting our science base, improving our skill base, and making sure that all our markets are as exposed to international competition as we possibly can, and indeed perfecting our own domestic competition policies. So it's a big agenda, and I'm very grateful for De La Rue coming along and geeing us up to pursue it. We've got a good panel here, led by Greg Hands, who is my own local Member of Parliament, much locally loved, and the Minister of State for Trade and Investment. And he's very kindly said that he will do the slight heavy lifting job on a panel, which is sort of set the story out for us. We're very lucky to have Allie, Renison, the Head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors. She's done a lot of work, and her special subjects are essentially employment and trade, so she's very well placed to chime in and help us get a purchase on what the issues will be. And Richard Hurd, the Chief Commercial Officer of De La Rue, has very kindly come along to represent the sponsors, but also to talk about some of the practical opportunities I know that he thinks that are available. So, Greg, could you bear to sort of set the scene for us and set our cap straight as we go ahead?
Well, fantastic, Warwick, and thank you very much indeed. And thank you also to Policy Exchange and to De La Rue and everybody for being here. It's been a very, very encouraging day, I think, here at Party Conference. We heard all this afternoon 4 fantastic speeches setting out the case for global Britain, starting off with Liam Fox on trade, Priti Patel on international development, Michael Fallon on defence, and then Boris Johnson on foreign policy. And I think actually the 4 of them showed the incredible reach that the UK has in this space. And I think that's where we should start this panel, is really thinking about how the UK actually really does punch above its weight. I forget who said that in the 1960s. It was Douglas Hurd in the 1980s. Said that Britain punches above its weight. And I think Britain still very much does so. Just as a reminder, we are the only major economy that does both, spend 0.7% of GNI on international development and 2% of GDP on defence, the only major country that does that. But it's well beyond just the numbers. You know, we are, London is the #1 city in the world for universities. The UK has got 4 of the top 20 universities. We're the #1 destination for foreign direct investment. We are the #1 in many, many things, and I think we should never forget that. And I think as all 4 of our Secretaries of State showed earlier, really confident and on the front foot to show the best of Britain to the world. So that's what I would say as a starting point. I don't mean to sound complacent, because I think there are some issues there. I think just to pick on a couple of things, I think the UK, we've forgotten how to speak languages. I'm just going to use that as a micro example of something where our competitive edge could be a lot stronger. And secondly, I think not everybody in Britain is as confident as we might be on this panel of Britain's capabilities on an international sphere. I'm thinking, for example, of, say, exporters. The UK really doesn't export enough. In fact, exports as a percentage of our GDP is actually the lowest in the European Union, at around 26%. The second lowest, by the way, is Greece. Germany's up at about 47%. So there are deficiencies, if you like, in the overall UK offer. But I think overall we've got so much, so many good reasons to be out there in the world on the front foot talking about global Britain. Let me just say a few things about the Department for International Trade. because obviously last summer the Department for exiting the European Union got most of the attention in what are these things, what civil servants called a MOG. Now, what is a MOG? A MOG is, in parlance, a machinery of government change. And often these things are quite obscure and don't necessarily mean that much. You rename a government department, this, that, or the other. What often happens is particular parts of government get moved around. Skills always seems to get moved between business and education and back again or whatever else. But occasionally, on these things, a leader can really show what is at the heart of their thinking with how you arrange and name government departments. I'm going to use a foreign example, first of all. George W. Bush. Whatever you think of him as a president of the United States, when he founded the Department for Homeland Security, he sent out very clearly a message of what he wanted to achieve as president of the United States for those 8 years. Theresa May founded a Department for International Trade. Now, as a way of background, does anybody know the last time there was a UK government department that had the word trade in it?
Was that Michael Heseltine at the end of the Labour government when he was president
Nope.
of trade?
The President of the Board of Trade has existed throughout this time, was actually, going back to the first thing that people do, was actually Gordon Brown when he became Prime Minister. The first thing he did was abolish the Department for Trade and Industry and rename it the Department for Business, Enterprise and Regulatory Reform. Big picture messaging there. But Theresa May not only put trade back there, but gave it its own sole government department, which I think showed a clear message, both domestically and internationally, of where the place that trade will be for this government. Very quickly, Warwick, just what do we do as our department? Broadly 3 areas. Exports, I've already talked about some of the issues there, but actually we've got some fantastic exports. I mean, I'm sat next to Delarue, possibly one of our greatest exporters. We do have some fantastic export stories. We just need to be doing more of it and more widely and better. Second area is on investment, where we are the number one. You know, we are the number one country in Europe for foreign direct investment coming into the country. And that is partly because of global Britain, because we are open. You know, fundamentally, Brits, so long as you pay your taxes, so long as you provide jobs, so long as you add to our economy, we are relatively open to foreigners running companies, taking things over, so long as we can take over their companies, all of these things, and I think we're proud and we're in the right space there. Third area in our department, which is the area that I do, in fact, I've moved, Warwick, since you had the bio, I've moved from trade and investment to do trade policy. And this is all about Britain's free trading future, the future of things like free trade agreements and so on. A lot of hard work there at the moment, transitioning the UK's existing 40 free trade agreements through the European Union to be UK agreements. We've also set up 13 trade working groups with key markets to make sure that we're in the best place for the day, when the day comes that we can sign a free trade agreement, to make sure the UK is able to do that. But also in the interim, we shouldn't be waiting for that. We don't have to wait to have a free trade agreement with somebody. You know, there's a lot of trade barriers to remove or reduce out there in the world, and Liam, I, and the whole department are out there every week fighting for British business to make those barriers be reduced or come down. And that could be anything from lot codes on Scotch whisky bottles to fighting for companies like Delarue, particular problems in particular markets. So we're very engaging, we're very on the front foot, we work for British business as well. So that's where I sort of see our department, how our department fits into it all. And I'm just going to throw out one final sort of a big picture thought for you. And that is, there's been a lot of talk at this conference about having to win the arguments again for free markets. Well, free trade is as much part of it as free markets are. And free trade, to be honest, has been a little bit on the defensive, not just over the last year or two, but probably over the last 10 years or so. In actual fact, most of the barriers to trade that have been erected by G20 countries have come in the last 7 years or so. A number of barriers that weren't there before. There's a big case out there for making the case for global free trade, not only with our trading partners, but also with our domestic audience, with the people of this country. I think there's the UK, I think, is the most pro-free trade country in the world, but I still think that there's an argument to be made, an argument to be had, and an argument to be won out there with the UK population as well, and we should not be shy of fighting it. And that's one of the reasons, again, why Theresa May set up the department, put Liam in charge. He's a fantastic evangelist for free trade, and we all need to be out there on the front foot, including businesses, actually making the case, reminding people that free trade boosts prosperity, it boosts consumer choice, it creates jobs, and allows prosperity, and is a vital part of our future. So I guess that sort of sets the scene, I hope. But I'm very thankful, and then take any questions after the rest of them.
No, Greg, thank you very much. That does set the scene very neatly. I mean, I think you're absolutely on the money. Free trade is central to a free enterprise economy that has access to the international division of labour. It has been under challenge. Policy Exchange takes trade very seriously. We have a trade unit headed by Dr. Jeff Raby, who's a very distinguished former Australian trade ambassador and played a central role at the World Trade Organization. We recognise that some of the biggest obstacles in free trade come from the distortions that arise out of agriculture and the agricultural tariffs. And we published a very important paper about that earlier in the summer. And we will be shortly publishing a further paper about the whole principle of comparative advantage and the big story of international trade, something that Policy Exchange takes very seriously indeed. Now, I think it will be a neat place now for Richard to come in and talk about the practical things of running an international business that's playing its part in these markets.
Well, thank you, Warwick, and thank you, everybody, for attending. I feel like I've already had a very generous welcome already, and you've done all my work for me. But I think it's probably worth stressing that one of the benefits, the reasons why De La Rue has existed for 200 years, is precisely because we've been a beneficiary of free and open trade globally. We're very lucky in the sense that we, in any given year, operate in about 140 different countries. And again, I'll come back to the punching above our weight comment. We're a £500 million business. 85% of our work is overseas. 1% of our work is in the EU. We've had our European calamity. That was when the euro was introduced. It's a bit difficult to make an argument to produce the euro when you're in the UK. So as a consequence, we're in this wonderful position where we're insulated from Brexit. Equally, it's probably the single greatest reason why we as a business are extremely optimistic about the future for the UK, because we are out there operating in markets across all the continents. And the reason why we're successful is because we have great people, we have great product, and I have to say we get good support from the UK government. I can't say that the spirit of free trade exemplified by the UK is necessarily replicated globally. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that, but even close to home in the EU, that is the case. So if I may give you some examples, we're in the middle of a procurement at the moment for the UK passport. I can't comment on that, but obviously because we're in the middle of a procurement. But I think it's a great credit that the UK government runs an open and fair competition. And in fact, our competition are two French companies. It's therefore a shame that we can't compete for the French passport, isn't it? Or the German passport, for that matter. Yep. And you might well want to ask yourself why that is the case. And I don't think it's the UK that has all the questions to answer, and I don't think the burden of proof should be on us about being open to do business, when actually we're very open to do business globally as a country. I mean, I think you've raised a number of issues that I think should come out during the course of the conversation. But the one observation I would make is I would really implore Whitehall, and indeed everybody in this room, not to succumb to a sort of political snowblindness associated with Brexit. Because business is happening every day in every corner of the globe, and British businesses can and will be successful. And we shouldn't get wrapped around the axle on Brexit. At the moment, we as a business are frantically trying to win business right across Africa and Asia. In every country we're operating, we're up against the French and the Germans and the Americans. And if I take the Germans as an example, they will quite happily have us tied up around the axle with Brussels, negotiating for 2 years. And at the last minute, I suspect Angela Merkel will step in and make sure that the interests of German business are preserved and enhanced. Meanwhile, she's traveling the globe, espousing the virtues of German industry in a global market. And it doesn't take an FTA to be successful, okay? Yeah. Don't get fixated on FTAs. They're big, heavy lift, bureaucratic mechanisms. Actually, governments sign memorandums of understanding, government-to-government memorandums of understanding on a day-by-day basis, and we regularly have to limbo under them or around them to stay ahead of our competition because we're not doing that. So I think if I was to give one message to you today, it's we should be really, really positive, but don't get fixated on Brexit. It's a big world out there.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about one of the things. Policy Exchange takes Brexit very seriously. We think there are genuine opportunities there. But again, one of the things we say, there's more to life than Brexit. And many of the things that, if you like, are slightly amplified through Brexit, are things we should be doing in any event, like our skills agenda, our science agenda, and so on. Allie.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to maybe sort of divide my brief comments into two sections. One to pick up on where Richard and Greg left off. It was interesting to me, I saw today an unnamed deputy editor of a certain national newspaper talking about basically poking the stick at the Secretary of State for National Trade, saying, where are all your deals? And I actually thought that was really irresponsible because at the moment we actually have this opportunity in terms of, certainly if there's a transitional period, but leading up to Brexit, to actually sort out what our trade policy priorities are. But I'll come back to trade policy in a minute because that's where I think actually unfortunately you can't really escape Brexit at all. But on the trade promotion side of things, it's interesting to me, I wish a lot of this conversation had been happening when the EU was doing a lot of its trade agreements, quite frankly, because I remember sort of having to do some of the government's job, quite frankly, on TTIP and explaining why it wouldn't mean the end of the NHS, even though this has nothing to do with business interests, quite frankly, in that respect. So it's a belated conversation. I'm glad it's happening now. But one of the things that I found when we were surveying a lot of our members at the IOD about what the market access barriers to the US were, was that they didn't really, and anyone who's worked on trade policy here knows this anyways, they didn't really speak the same language that people in government were talking about. What are your problems getting into the US? And the things that they wanted to advance on really actually had nothing to do with the trade agreement. It was really about, how can I sort of deal with the US's sort of corporate tax regime, particularly for foreign institutions. It was about how can I make it easier to go over to the US to do an engineering project and a contract for more than 90 days, for example. These are things that don't necessarily need to fit within the aegis of a trade agreement. And similarly, I think on the trade promotion side of things, that is stuff that actually I think is the bread and butter of what business looks to in terms of how it internationalizes. Now, I don't really particularly like to use the word, even though I understand it's the common parlance, export, because I think for a services-based economy, I am always staggered by the amount of members who don't think that they export because what they do doesn't classically fit into sort of an antiquated notion of what an export is in terms of goods trade. So we like to talk about internationalizing our business at the IOD as much as possible. But for that, those are the kind of areas where government can make an immediate impact. And it's interesting you mentioned that with respect to how can a business sort of grow itself overseas, a lot of that comes down to, well, am I in touch with the right people? Do I have this right support either from government or from the private sector as an intermediary to sort of facilitate my engagement overseas? These are the things, and we often tend to sort of pick and choose and borrow things from Germany. It always seems to be Germany, whether it's sort of on how we do sort of a labor market regulation or whether we, depending on what side of the spectrum, political spectrum you come from. But if you look at what Germany does, we do find ourselves very often comparing ourselves to Germany. And for there has been that kind of hand-in-hand government-industry engagement tradition for a very, very long time. So we're probably not going to be able to do exactly what they do. We also don't export all the stuff that they do. And I would say one quick note on that. It's quite interesting that when you go and talk to German manufacturers, they are fascinated about what I would call, it's a very wonkish term, the servicification of manufacturing. So what Rolls-Royce did, and it really sort of blazed the trail in terms of realizing that they could actually probably, instead of just exporting a product, they could export a contract of care, solutions, for example. And there's a lot of interest in Germany about how that advanced sort of manufacturing in terms of adding services to the mix also becomes an export for the UK. So I think there's a lot that can be done in the interregnum between now and when we leave the EU. As you mentioned, things that we probably always should have done. I think one of the interesting things about Brexit is that in some areas there may be opportunities that would have come about had we not been the EU. There are a lot of areas where it becomes the psychological impetus to think more globally. And I would include in that a lot of businesses who currently, they're engaged in sort of EU supply chains and they're already thinking, potentially they may be actually lost in that supply chain. And so they're forcing themselves to look further afield. So there's a lot of things I think the government can do in that respect, and I'll probably come back to the questions that you've actually raised here in the discussion. Where I think you can't really escape Brexit is when you start looking at trade policy, because a lot of the questions, and I think it was interesting to listen to the Brexit Secretary David Davis talk about how it was a sort of a back and forth Barney with Michel Barnier a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about how it was a simple belief in the ideas of free trade that should guide the negotiations and our trade policy more widely. Trade is rules-based. Trade policy is rules-based. There are certain, what I would call remorseless logics of what the consequence of certain choices are in terms of your trade with the EU, for example. If you are not in a customs union, you have rules of origin apply. I am really quite concerned about the amount of members who are predominantly engaged in EU goods trade who've never had to deal with this. Now, these things are not insurmountable. There are accumulation agreements, I won't get into everything here, where you can sort of get around some of these issues. But there are other choices, for example, with respect to, if we're not going to be in the single market, to what is the future of regulatory cooperation and alignment with the EU, because it's interesting that I think one of the good things that the department is doing now is putting in place all this capacity building operation. Greg mentioned all the working groups with different countries, and those are very important pre-steps to actually go before any trade negotiation. You have sort of the scoping exercise, so to speak. When it comes down to crunch time, and you have to talk about what you're particularly for regulation, what you're putting on the table. As far as I can see, and from talking to various third countries, they're quite happy to start the discussion, but they need to know where we're ending up with the EU. To what extent, even if we're not in the single market, that alignment is really alignment to a certain extent with respect to EU regulatory standards. So I'm afraid in the policy space, it's quite difficult to completely get away from Brexit in that regard. One of the things that I think is going to be quite interesting, and I don't think has clicked yet, the penny's dropped in the discourse about trade and Brexit and the intersection in the UK yet, is how we approach trade defense, because I think that's actually one of the interesting areas where we really can part company, and you'll probably hear from my accent, I'm American but a dual national, which means I'm far enough removed to understand how it works, but also to say what I don't like about it, quite frankly. And the trade defense as sort of an instrument of trade policy has been there long before Trump in the US, quite frankly. I think he's actually continuing just the trend and exacerbating it to a certain extent. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in, and it is one of those rare areas where I don't think actually what we decide to do will have massive implications for our market access to Europe, is how we approach trade defense policy. How can we avoid being dragged down into the trade dispute phenomenon that sort of really is galvanizing? I mean, you look at the WTO, and the WTO is predominantly a forum for dispute resolution. It's important, but that's a sort of sad reality in the state of reflection of the state of play now. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how the UK looks at, we will have producers who want to make sure that their interests are defended, but it will be really interesting to be part of that consultation process to say, how can we make sure that when we do launch, anti-dumping investigations, put on countervailing duties, that we're doing that only when absolutely necessary. And I think that was one of the interesting things in the EU case, is that very often you could have a small consortium of producers, for example, German solar panel manufacturers, who could very easily trigger a sort of cross-EU, basically, investigation into Chinese sort of solar panels. And so I think it's an opportunity to really change the way in which trade defense is constructed in the world, because that's where I think, unfortunately, trade liberalization is a great initiative, but right now, unfortunately, we're being pulled down, many countries are being pulled down a much more sort of defensive orientation. And the last thing I would add on that is it'll be really interesting to see whether we have the provision for, right now, we don't have trade disputes within the EU because we're in, obviously, the customs union and the common commercial policy. I would add, by the way, that it's the common commercial policy that stops us from trading, handling external trade relations, not being in a customs union per se. And so I'm hoping that we don't actually, when we're in a free trade agreement, have the provision for slapping on duties on, getting into trade disputes with the EU. But one of the things that depends on is how closely aligned we are on sort of competition policy and restrictions on state subsidies. And I'm not saying that the EU state aid regime will continue to apply wholesale, but if you want to avoid And it was interesting, I was in DC a couple of weeks ago talking to what I would call the free trade purists at the Cato Institute. And they were surprised at this debate about how do we do trade defense going forward. It hadn't really cropped up that much in the debate about our trade policy going forward. And we came to the conclusion that you're going to have very, very close restrictions, tight restrictions on both sides' ability to basically not distort their market and give subsidies to sort of producers. And I would say in closing that I'm a little bit worried about some of the discourse I hear from some people saying that Brexit is an opportunity to bring in Buy British. I don't think that's what certainly Policy Exchange would say is the reason for Brexit, quite frankly.
No, certainly not. Thank you very much for that. And I think you're absolutely right. The main, I think, impact of Brexit will be is a sort of Monker-Olson moment, where you have quite an institutional shudder that causes people to think in a different way about what they've been doing, and you'll be surprised how an institutional shudder can help you actually re-examine previous practices and do things in a different way. Now, I think it's time to have some questions. Can they be crisp and questions that can be answered? So I'll start with the gentleman there, and then the lady behind.
Hello, my name is Nick Wright. I'm from Newable, which is a delivery partner of the Department for International Trade. And my question is really about helping small businesses. Agreements are one thing, expertise and resources to exploit it is another. And small businesses need three things: ITAs, which is actually under risk or under threat at the moment, international trade advisors, fit-for-purpose export finance offer, because there isn't one, and the third and final thing, which is a proactive, what they call post, i.e. overseas government representatives, where, frankly, it's a bit variable at the moment.
Thank you very much. Lady behind.
Dairy farmer from 25 minutes away from here, 500 acres of lush pasture land. This is my third Brexit meeting, and I realise now that it's going to be the cheapest goods that get bought. And this will apply to our milk. We adhere to the European very high standards of animal welfare, and we provide a countryside which is sustainable and green. We go to a heck of a lot of trouble and expense to do this. With less money for our milk, we can't do it. We were told yesterday at the Jacob Rees-Mogg meeting, we will be in the sector of the economy that requires extra stimulus to production, which is politics speak for produce more goods for the same money. From all this, I presume that everybody in the Conservative Party and at these meetings doesn't care less about British food and farming. They'll buy cheap, they'll buy foreign, it won't adhere to the animal welfare standards of which I am proud. Your countryside will be covered with thousands of houses, and that'll please you.
Thank you very much. A gentleman there.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Abdul Mateen from the Isle of Wight Conservative Association. We saw China giving cheap steel, which costed British steel many jobs. Tata Steel from India came along and saved the company. We need to make sure that we are producing goods cheap enough so that we can compete with China. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Allie to kick off. If you're happy. Pick on any aspect of the questions. You don't have to come on them all. Just what you fancy, or none at all.
I'm going to do them in reverse order. I don't think the UK can compete on cheap products in manufacturing, quite frankly. I think some of that has been and gone. It was interesting because when you looked at Tata's report, when they were basically sort of mooted the idea of selling off the blast furnaces in Port Albert, they very explicitly said, and I looked at the annual report, it became a thing about sort of Chinese dumping. And when you looked at what the causes were for their looking at relocation, it barely featured. It was about energy costs, it was about pension costs, it was about the fact that they wanted to move to the Netherlands because they had a sort of more advanced manufacturing plant. So I don't think we can compete on that specific element. And I think that's where the focus on advanced manufacturing and trade in that is probably the way of the future.
Well, I guess we're on 2 points. On the issue of competition, we'll win where we're better. And I think there are lots of examples of British businesses which are successful overseas. And again, I would really encourage you to not succumb to parochialism and see the business which we feel is lost here in the UK or that British businesses lose overseas, because I certainly on the time I spend overseas see lots of British businesses being successful as well, albeit it's very competitive. And so was it Nick? Yeah. I think the establishment of the new department is welcome news. And I mean, before I was in Delaware, I was working in the defence and intelligence community when David Cameron was very supportive of replicating the defence sales model, moving it into security and beyond into other sectors. So I think we've seen this government be really committed to doing that. But it's always easier if we can find an easier way of engaging with Whitehall. One of the reasons why Delarue is relatively successful as a company is because we have great support from the UK missions overseas. They're absolutely fantastic. And the sort of trade representatives, I mean, they change the title every so often, but broadly speaking, you've got really well-motivated, well-skilled people there trying to be helpful. But it's a bit of a numbers game. One of the issues that we find is, well, I'm always tempted to ask you the question, how big you think we are as a business. We're actually pretty small. We're a £500 million business. And it takes us quite a lot of effort to keep that business going because our customer base is so diffuse. So we'd always welcome a way by which we can engage with as fewer people, as fewer departments as possible in Whitehall in order to be successful. And actually, we've had limited but positive success with export finance as well. But I think the issue is in Whitehall, and it's a bit of a cultural issue. And candidly, I still get the sense that government finds it difficult to deal with business. They're a bit worried at some point we're going to blow up in their face, we're going to do something that's a bit embarrassing, and that makes them to a certain extent institutionally reticent. Where I see Brexit as being a real opportunity for a reset is in the sort of the opportunity for government to truly see business as being a strategic partner. And actually, even in procurement, I'm an absolute advocate of free trade. As you'll have gathered from my opening comments, I applaud the fact that our government competes everything. But there is an opportunity for government to look at UK business as a strategic asset. It's got considerable procurement power, and it can help UK business overseas. And with a combination of those factors, I think we can be competitive. Now, it is absolutely fair to say we cannot be competitive in every sector. There are huge geopolitical global trends which, frankly, we cannot swim in the face of. But that doesn't mean the country as a whole cannot be successful. Great.
Well, thank you. I'm going to try and answer two questions to combine sort of the different questions asked. The question about SMEs and the question about agriculture and trade defence and trade remedies more generally. On SMEs, you're right. I think government hasn't been that good at supporting SMEs in the export space, but we are doing something about it. You're right, having people on the ground embedded in chambers of commerce, for example, on a regional basis, the ITAs is important. We've also introduced what I think is a fantastic portal, great.gov.uk, where you can find an enormous amount of information about export markets. You can really dig into detail. For example, if you want to export to the Netherlands, you can find out on our great.gov.uk all about not just the basic stuff like, capital city Amsterdam, population, whatever, GDP. It actually takes you through, for example, the Netherlands got an amazing online marketplace. And it takes you through, which is a unique Dutch feature, and it takes you through how you understand the Dutch online market, because they have a very, very separate and specific setup. Export finance, we've doubled the risk limit on UK export finance, and we want to diversify that portfolio. It's overwhelmingly concentrated in one or two sectors and one or two parts of the world. One of the ways to do that is through SMEs. Instead of, as in previous years, having to send in long application forms to UK Export Finance and wait for somebody to stamp it, send it upstairs and all that kind of stuff, it will actually be approved directly through banks due to an MOU we signed with the banks just last week. I'd be interested in feedback, by the way, if that gets through. But the banks have said that they will approve SME loans so long as they follow our criteria using an algorithm set by the Department for International Trade. And I would expect to see that cut a lot of bureaucracy, make it a lot more straightforward, and actually diversifies risk a lot. Because if you start lending to a lot of SMEs, of course, not all of them are going to make it, but it diversifies your portfolio significantly. And I think in terms of diplomatic posts, I mean, one of the best things that we did when we took power in 2010, it was a specific priority of David Cameron's, was to make our foreign posts more commercially minded. Sometimes, I think in the past, our diplomats, it was all about going into a meeting and coming out, so long as everybody had a warm feeling, that was sort of the purpose of the meeting in the past. Now I think our meetings abroad and our posts are much more transactional and deliverable focused than perhaps they used to be, but I personally think there may be further to go there as well. Let me deal with the whole issue of agriculture, because actually, UK food and drink is I think I'm right in saying, our number one goods exporting area at the moment. So actually, the question shouldn't just be a defensive question about cheap foreign agricultural products coming in. There's actually an opportunity there for the UK farming, UK food and drink sectors to take advantage of free trade and get our high-quality products out there. I don't agree with you that necessarily that it'll be a race to the bottom and the British consumer will simply buy the cheapest product. In actual fact, I think British consumers in the last 10 years, 15, 20 years, have become far more discerning about their food and drink. So I don't think it's a race to the bottom. I think it's actually an opportunity. Having said that, we will make sure that there are trade remedies in place. That'll be a key part of the UK policy as we go forward. There'll be a raft of post-Brexit trade legislation coming up. Trade remedies, trade defence will be certainly part of that to make sure that we have the ability to take these measures after Brexit if we need to.
Just quickly, because I think that your question also dealt predominantly with subsidy issues. I'm going to go. I'm going to go out on a limb. I don't think that in the next couple of years you're going to see certainly on eradication. I don't. The benchmark here that people always like to talk about is what New Zealand did in the 80s. I don't think you're going to see it on that scale in that short of a time frame, quite frankly. Chiefly because, and this is maybe a controversial point to make, no one in the government probably wants to blame Brexit for the decline of farming, so to speak, British farming. So I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. However, it was interesting. I spoke at the National Farmers Union conference earlier this year, and I was quite struck by, there was a lot of farmers, old and young there, who they knew change was coming, but they weren't so obstinate that they couldn't see the benefits of how could you actually make it more efficient. And as far as I can understand, that the most recent big reform to the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy in the EU, was to sort of have these greening conditions attached. So I don't think that's actually the most efficient way of basically reforming subsidies, quite frankly. And I think that the UK could probably do a slightly better job in that sense. But I don't think that there's going to be a sort of slash and burn anytime soon. But that's my political prediction.
If I could just add something to that, you also raised, I think, animal welfare. And really important to know that the UK will continue its own incredibly high standards of animal welfare. And actually nothing in trade agreements obviates the need and the desirability of there to being domestic regulation in these areas. And the right to regulate would be unaffected. So when Michael Gove talks passionately about animal welfare, including when we're outside of the European Union, he means it, that the UK's animal welfare standards will remain very, very high. I would hope the highest in the world.
Right, now some more questions. Gentleman at the front there.
Thank you. Jeremy Thomas, adopting, I think, my policy exchange persona of interested spectator. And if I can take Greg back to the beginning of his remarks, and I hope I have this right, when you were speaking about the transformation of existing EU third country agreements into UK third country agreements, what evidence do we have that we would be able to maintain those duty schedules which exist in the existing agreements, not least as we would only, to quote Miriam Gonzalez Durantes, among others, be able to offer 50 plus million consumers, as distinct from the 500 million plus consumers which the EU has as a bargaining chip in its own negotiations. Thank you.
Another question. Gentleman at the back there.
Saviour Woodward from DP World Ports. What does the panel think about free trade zones?
And one more question. There's somebody there in the middle there. Can you see? Yes? Spectacles, yes?
one word that is normally thrown around when talking about trade within the European Union is regulation. So post-Brexit would presumably mean less regulation. So my question to all of you is, which regulation in particular would you be happy to lose?
Richard, would you like to pick up?
Give a man a moment to come up with a cogent answer.
And remember, you can be like a magpie. Pick and choose what you fancy to answer.
So, first of all, I'm assuming the question on FTZs was in the UK. Yes. Yeah. Well, as somebody in the business which has been a beneficiary of FTZs in the overseas markets, then I'd be a huge exponent of them. I can't, fundamentally, why do they appeal to a business like De La Rue as a foreign direct investor? There's an investment, there's a beneficial investment element, absolutely. But actually, what tends to go with FTZs as well is a whole lot of wraparound services that just make it easy for a business to come in and invest in a foreign country. We sometimes forget, we are all aware of how impenetrable Whitehall can be at times. So see that through the filter of being a foreign business trying to invest in the country, and with the best will in the world, we can actually make it quite difficult for them. And my own experience with FTs is actually, if I take the Middle East as an example, is just the ease with which they act as a conduit for you to navigate the process to make your investment. Quite aside from whatever the actuarial benefit might be to the business having made your investment. So I would certainly express myself as being an advocate of those. I have to say on regulation, I'm struggling a little bit to come up with them. Probably one of the reasons for that is precisely because we're operating in so many markets, so the issues we face are so varied. But I have to come back to the point I made in my opening comment. It does rankle to me that in the world of OJU, the European Journal of European Procurement Regulations, our allies in the European Union, let's say, do not apply those with the same degree of vigour that the UK government does. And I find that particularly vexatious.
Another question was to Greg, but I might just have a quick stab at the FTAs one first. There are probably 2, maybe 3 areas I see converting FTAs a bit problematic, but they will be. I think they're probably doable, but depending on very goodwill from our third country partners that they don't want to actually create extract new concessions to a certain extent. One is around what you mentioned, sort of splitting off of TRQs, for example. It was interesting, I saw today that the New Zealand Deputy Trade Minister, was quite surprisingly open about his discomfort at the idea that as long as the UK and the EU can agree basically to extract or recreate sort of the TRQs for the UK at the WTO, then that would be fine. I don't think they were, and New Zealand is a very close trading ally and partner of the UK, so that was sort of to me a first example of these things are not that straightforward. Secondly is around also, though, there's a lot of references to EU law in EU trade agreements, particularly the new ones, particularly the Canadian one that's just been agreed and provisionally implemented. So I think that some of the issues that we're probably going to face in terms of the withdrawal bill and trying to replace the references to EU law, a bit difficult where we don't even have our own sort of regulatory agency, but that will sort of be dealt with sort of in time. That applies as well. And then the third one is probably around rules of origin. Whose rules of origin are you actually using in the free trade deals, because we don't have our own set up at the moment. These will be, you could do all this quite easily if you didn't have the sort of the clock ticking, and that's my biggest concern about it. I think with the goodwill of the third country partners, there is another question about the trade agreements that we have that are much more closely with countries who are much more closely integrated into the EU, so Switzerland, Norway, Turkey, for example. It's hard to see how you can really just do these bilaterally without involving the EU in that discussion. So sometimes it feels a little bit like an elephant in the room.
Great.
Well, Allie is broadly right on the transformation of the EU FTA. That's a key part of what our department is doing at the moment, is transforming these 40 agreements. We've got in principle agreement, I think, from all of the major countries in those 40 to do it. There are a few questions in there. TRQs, this is kind of what quota, how you split a quota between the UK and the rest of the EU, how exactly that split will work. But I think there's nothing, by the way, the EU is perfectly aware that we're doing this, and we're doing it in conversation with them. So it's not like we're going going in a spirit of ill will. I think both parties realise this is going to happen and has to happen. And it actually provides a degree of continuity for business that takes advantage of those 40 free trade agreements. They're not, by the way, the only solution, because actually those 40 FTAs, whilst they're significant, if I were to tell you that more than 80% of the value to the UK in those FTAs comes from just two of them, Switzerland and South Korea, two very important trading partners, but nevertheless not two of the world's top 8 economies, will give you an idea that actually that transforming those 40 FTAs is not going to be the whole answer to Britain's free trading future. And then finally, on free trade zones, they've tended to be, and I appreciate actually DP World, I appreciated the presentation you gave me briefly when I saw you at Thames Gateway earlier this year. They tend to be, I don't think anything is excluded, but they tend to have been in either large countries that are opening up or small countries that want to take a particular distinctive position on trade, whereas previously they haven't been very pro-free trade. I'm not sure the UK meets the criteria of those that have used free trade zones before. But again, I'm sure that is something that is not excluded as we go forward.
In terms of the regulations, I think the procurement directive is a very important thing, which it makes UK public sector procurement very clumsy and expensive. And some of the regulations we want to examine in the future, some of those relating to biotechnology, and also the whole approach to the precautionary principle, which does make it very difficult to bring new products to market. And the country that's been principally damaged by it has been Germany. They had a very dynamic chemicals and metallurgy industry. Because it's expensive, it's slow, they've actually lost market share, and I think that will be an area that we should certainly be examining very carefully. The other thing I'll just say is that many of the changes you want to bring in, whether it's fundamental change in agriculture, whether it's changes in those we have time to think about these things. We do not have to do things overnight. A lot of businesses will need to transition. They will need to have things phased. If you're running an agricultural business and you've invested against one background, and you've bought some very expensive kit, and it's going to be amortized over 4, 5, 6 or 7 years, I actually don't see there's any problem in actually phasing these things over time and giving people time to actually adjust, providing it's within the framework of the UK ministers directing themselves. Another couple of questions. Gentleman there.
Thank you. I wanted to just ask 2 quick questions. The first is, there'll be obviously an increased focus on trade, and as we have more trade agreements, we'll be having to deal with other countries' different standards. We won't be imposing our standard upon everybody else. So the question is where you've got businesses, particularly those with production lines and things like that, how do you expect the companies best to manage their affairs so that they can say, right, we're exporting this to Japan, we've got to do it to this dimension, whereas we're exporting the same product to Mexico, and it's got to have that dimension.
No, thank you very much indeed. And the lady at the front.
Can I ask one more?
I think we fight against the clock, and there's a lady at the front who's got another question.
Thank you. In fact, my grandmother used to work for De La Rue back in the early 1900s, and when she told us she used to spend all day printing banknotes, we just thought she was being a bit balmy. My question is, it's very easy these days to buy lots of goods and stuff online. How do we ensure that our standards remain high and are met by foreign countries wanting to sell to us?
Thank you. And one more question? Gentleman over there.
Thanks. It's Brian Connell. I'm a counsellor and also a logistics consultant. And my question is that the focus in the comments has been on goods, the WTO and so on, and yet we know that services are even more important to our economy. So I'd welcome reflections from the panel on either the connection to goods and also how optimistic should we be about free trade in services.
And I think there is a question over there, because I'm trying to get to a stage where we can bring things towards an end and the panel can sort of say their goodbyes to us in summary. So we have that question over there. If you don't mind hanging for a question.
Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Richard Pears. I'm a General Party member, but I run a sports company in Eastern Europe, British-based, but we have sports training for children. We have recently started a series of sports days called British Sports Day, and we've realised the power of community events to bring together local businesses, British businesses, and I would just like to get your feedback, whether you know of any other events happening like this that the embassies are supporting, and whether this could be an avenue for future policy to be or supported to grow British communities and British businesses abroad.
Lovely. Now, what I'm going to suggest is we get the panel to comment on those questions as they fancy and see fit. And then when they've done that, I think we should ask them to actually sort of do a little summary for us before we move on to an early drink. So, Allie, can you kick us off?
Yeah. I'm trying to be optimistic on the services question. Having said that, having watched, where was the question? Sorry. Having watched how this has progressed in the last couple, 5-10 years, it's hard to be optimistic because of what now. Now, I would love, I'm trying my hardest to say that when the UK enters the game, that will be a game changer. And I think in some ways, if it manages to, for example, you look at digital services, there's some quite interesting language in the TPP around services. If the UK was able to sort of somehow in the future latch onto that, maybe. But I'm not that optimistic just because, and I feel like sort of, even though, I've not been doing this for that long compared to some of my compatriots, you talk to people who've been watching Doha, for example, for 20, 30 years, and they're pretty jaded about the future of that, quite frankly. It depends on sort of in what context, because I think one of the interesting things about services is that, there's not a huge amount of progress at the multilateral level. They're trying to do it at the plurilateral level with the trade and services agreement, but the EU specifically actually, from what I understand, the French government is kind of holding up some of the progress on that end. So a lot of this can be done sometimes outside of the confines, in my opinion, of a free trade agreement. One of the most important things for a services-based economy is movement of people. And that's one of the areas where I do think, on the face of it, the difference in the UK being out of the EU, if you were to look at the US, for example, the UK being out of the EU and the new administration potentially actually could make a difference because Congress basically said they weren't going to talk about a movement of people in the context of trade agreements after, I can't remember what it was, either sort of Singapore or Chile. And so I think, and there was a lot of reticence about doing that in the context of TTIP because you weren't dealing with one country, you're dealing with 28. So I think that there'll be potentially some more openness towards that with respect to movement of people, potentially facilitating sort of streamlining visa procedures, extending them. That happened in the EU-Canadian deal, for example. And then also, I feel like I should almost deflect your question to Mark sitting in front of me, but if you look at financial services, the previous Treasury did not want to talk about financial services in the context of a trade agreement. In fact, that's actually, generally speaking, there is a prudential carve-out for financial services and trade deals that I think keeps people from making much progress on that. Potentially, with the new administration, I suppose, you could make some progress in that. That's where the Treasury has long been resistant to that in the US, but potentially with a new change of administration and it being dealt with between the UK and the US, that there could be, in fact, there's a conference between two big financial services industries, including the City UK, on this very point. The question is, does it go in a trade agreement, or can you do some of this outside of the confines of a trade agreement? And I do think that not only because we're not in the place to do it yet, but also it was interesting from my discussions in the US a couple of weeks ago in DC, they are starting to try to look to do things that don't have to fit into a trade agreement, so you don't have things traded off against each other at the last minute. But I think there's still an impetus to try and tackle that within the confines of trade agreements generally. But with services, I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic, but I'm cautious about any big changes anytime soon.
Richard.
I'll be very brief in the interest of time. I'll just pick up on the question about online services. There is a role for government here. Sadly, I think too many brands are prepared to wear the risk of counterfeit goods in the market. Actually, our biggest commercial customer is Microsoft, and we provide all the brand authentication solutions for Microsoft. So if you buy a Microsoft licensed product in the market, De La Rue protects the integrity of that product. but that costs money. But it matters to Microsoft because that's also a chief source of their revenue. Too many brands are prepared to wear the risk in the market, frankly, and I think there is a role for government intervening here. I always get irritated. I said, came from the defence and security sector, and however profound a security threat, ultimately security protection is a grudge buy, and unfortunately, brand protection seems to fall into the same place where brands will just be prepared to take the risk. I was diving in Thailand a couple of months ago, and I walked down a main street in Khao and saw Hugo Boss T-shirts hanging up, and remarked to myself, wow, the power of their distribution channel is incredible. Well, I suspect Boss know that their ripped-off T-shirts are being sold in the main streets of Khao and they just accept it. So until consumers turn away, there's not going to be a great change in the market.
Great.
So great questions again. Let me take what I hope is the easiest question from the back about community events. Definitely, British embassies and missions would love to, in principle, host events like that, participate, attend, put a bit of great branding on an event like that. That's the sort of thing that is bread and butter to them. So do approach me or approach them directly. Earlier this summer, I was in both Prague and Bucharest, and they do that kind of an event. I think on services, I think Allie spoke a lot of good sense on this. And we have to remember that the services are 80% of the UK economy in both GDP and in terms of employment. So it is an incredibly important part of our future. But equally, Allie is right that it doesn't need FTAs in many cases, to drive through service liberalisation. What it does need is actually sitting down with other governments and trying to talk through the barriers and to remove and reduce those barriers. Sometimes we've been more successful than others. The various efforts over the years on, say, financial services, legal services, accountancy into India hasn't been as successful as we would like it to be, but those efforts go on. That's one of the purposes of our trade working group with India, is to audit those kind of barriers. So services are very much at the forefront. And the UK's role in TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, is also, obviously, our goal is to have the UK as a standalone player in that agreement. And then the earlier questions on standards, Andrew's question on different standards, and will actually, I'm not sure if it's necessarily a Brexit-related question, but how do you make sure that you can sell a product between two markets that may have fundamentally different standards? Again, that's not an insurmountable obstacle. New Zealand and China, for example, which are two countries with incredibly different sizes, and they've got a thriving trading relationship. They've got a very good trade agreement between the two countries, and if they're able to do it in two entirely different markets and different cultures, then I think it's relatively straightforward. In terms of the standards overall, I mean, never forget there'll be a domestic right to regulate. Whatever comes in will need to meet UK domestic standards. We'll always be able to regulate. And going back to these points that have been made about the threats or alleged threats to the NHS from TTIP and all this kind of stuff, a lot of that is hyped because actually the UK will have the right to regulate. We can say what can or cannot happen within the NHS. So a lot of that is just thrown up as a bit of a chaff, which I was going to talk about in the concluding remarks, as a way of opposing free trade, in my view, wrongly or needlessly. But I think in terms of standards, never forget the UK, arguably will have more power outside of the European Union, more ability to regulate our own market than we have inside the European Union.
I think we really are very close to time. So I'm going to ask all the panelists to give their final finger wag to us all and to set us straight. Allie.
There's a lot of opportunities with Brexit, but I think a lot of them have rightly or wrongly opportunity costs in terms of how we deal with Europe going forward. And I just think there was an interesting paragraph from the PM's speech a couple of weeks ago where she talked about knowing that the decisions the government is making will have implications for market access to Europe. And I would just plead with people to understand that it's hard to differentiate between what is protectionism on Europe's part and what is the genuine remorseless logic of not being in certain arrangements like the single market and the customs union. Because I think to be an informed observer on trade policy, we need to sort of move beyond how we think about trade in terms of cutting tariffs from the 19th century. So that's my plea to the audience.
Richard?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? That many of the questions that have been raised today, I just made a quick note of some of the issues that we've been discussing around regulations, authentication standards, FTAs. And I think it's a terrible risk to see this as Brexit as being a vehicle by which we come up with some sort of Panglossian approach that solves all of these problems. And we've got to resist that temptation. These issues are not germane to Brexit. They're not germane to the journey that we're on in the next 2 years. These are issues that always exist when one nation seeks to trade with another one. So I think we need to see Brexit for what it is, and we also need to see the huge opportunity there is globally, where all of these issues exist and have to be surmounted on a day-by-day basis by British businesses and by government anyway. And, I'm with Boris, we should be optimistic.
Great. 3 points finally. First, I think the points made by everybody on this panel about not getting too fixated about free trade agreements is incredibly true. We can do so much outside of those and before those. Of course, we can't sign a free trade agreement until we're outside of the European Union in any case. So getting on with removing trade barriers is what my department does each and every day. Secondly, don't forget the domestic right to regulate, incredibly important. So a lot of the questions or problems that have been raised, we've got the ability in this country to be able to set the parameters that are needed to make sure that consumers are protected, labour rights are protected, etc. And then just finally, I think we've all got to get out there. I think the mere fact that people are here talking about trade, I think is an incredibly encouraging sign. I've done 3 fringes so far where the attendance has been really good. People are really interested in trade as a set of issues. I think it was Allie who said that the EU might not have done such a good job in recent years in terms of persuading their publics about the value and importance of free trade. I do look after a lot of our party's relations with Germany, which means that most years I go to the CDU party conference. And every year, in the same way that at the end of the Conservative Party conference, our Prime Minister comes out and delivers the speech, well, at the CDU along comes Angela Merkel and she delivers a speech to the party faithful. Her speech last year was really striking for one thing she said about trade. And that was she realised that they messed up in Germany in terms of free trade. She said that she can't understand it, how in Germany far more people will come and demonstrate against TTIP than will come and demonstrate against what's happening in Syria. And that was quite a striking remark as to how effectively other people had mobilised an anti-free trade agenda to actually get people out on the streets of Germany demonstrating against something called the TTIP. Now, can you imagine standing there in whatever language saying, bring down the TTIP, rather than against Putin, Syria, Assad, and whatever else? And that was quite a telling remark. We can't wait for the argument to come along. We've got to get out there and win that argument right away. Persuading people. By the way, it's not just a matter for us conservatives in this room. It's also very much a matter on the left as well. Trade unions in this country used to be relatively pro-free trade. I think they've turned relatively against free trade in recent years, and I think it's very much an argument for everybody who believes in prosperity and free trade to really get out there and make that case.
I think that there's no doubt in my mind that the public discussion of free trade in the United Kingdom has always been distorted by the European debate, because we have always taken the view that participating in Europe is a step towards freer trade. And many, many years ago, a former president of the Board of Trade, a Labour president of the Board of Trade, Douglas Jay, took me behind the bicycle sledge and sorted me out. And he said, you have to understand that actually by going into Europe, you're going into higher tariff barriers, both for agriculture and industrial products as well. And we now find ourselves in a rather odd position that we actually find it's quite expensive to import certain manufactured and food things, which are to protect manufacturers in Italy, Germany, and France. So particularly in textiles, shoes, and things like that, you will find that there is protection of things that we don't really manufacture here in the same way. And part of it is because we modernised our economy, made the uncomfortable structural changes to it in the 70s and 80s, and many of those industries aren't here, and over the last 20 years, they have been protected within a EU trade context. So we're in this rather odd position that a more free trade environment may help our consumers without damaging our producer interests as well. And I think one's got to keep sight of the fact that trade is not principally about flogging something halfway around the world to somebody who doesn't want it. It is about us back here having the full access to the International Division of Labour and buying things here that it suits us at quality and price anywhere in the world. And one can be very surprised what those choices turn out to be. I think our panel have done us proud, actually, in this early evening, late afternoon. I think it's been a very interesting debate. I'm very grateful to our sponsors. I'm very grateful to Greg coming along to help us, and Allie. I hope you've enjoyed it. Trade has really taken off in a way that it really wasn't on the agenda with us until recently. It's a big issue, and I think we're right to debate it. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you, Bob.